Welcome to Elevate, a Women's Leadership Institute podcast where we showcase stories, celebrate successes, and shift culture. All right, hello, welcome to Elevate, a Women's Leadership podcast. I am here with my esteemed guest, Holly Richardson. I told her earlier I feel like I have some imposter syndrome because she's so accomplished in so many areas, but so down to earth, right? She's just Holly. I want to give an official bio for her so you kind of have some context of who she is if you don't already know her. She's the Utah policy editor and a Desert News columnist, a former Utah legislator. She holds a master's degree in professional communication and a Ph.D. in political science, where she focused on public administration, nonprofit management, and international relations. She and her husband, Greg, are the parents of a large and unique family.
It's true.
It's true. So there's a lot to dig into today. I kind of want to give an overview of, we're going to talk a little bit about Utah policy and the legislative session that's just ended.
Great.
A couple of the bills that came out of that. We both work in this space where we want women to understand the political process, to run for office. We'll talk a little bit about that. And then we want to touch on your Ph.D.
Great.
And what you learned there. And
Great.
Any other random facts that come along.
Great.
So, first of all, I always like to ask people to tell us kind of a random tidbit about you. Like the human side of Holly.
Well, this is interesting. I hadn't planned on this, but right after the legislative session, I actually had an ulcer rupture, which I didn't know I had.
Yes.
Put me into ICU for 5 days, ambulance ride, almost died, but here I am. So,
oh my! And is this because of the session? Like,
I joke around that I have 2 ulcers, and I named them Donald Trump and the Utah legislature, and they tried to kill me. But the truth is, stress doesn't actually have that much to do with ulcers. So.
Awesome. I love that you named them. That's perfect.
So
that's fun.
I love all those legislators. They're my friends.
Of course. Of course. So let's talk about the session, because it just actually ended this week, right? All of those bills got either vetoed or signed by the governor.
So the session itself actually ended on March 1st at midnight, and then the governor had 20 days to either sign, veto, or let bills pass into law without his signature, and he actually did that on 2 bills. Okay. So he vetoed 7. He signed the other, 500 and something.
Yeah.
And he let 2 pass into law. So there were 591 that passed the legislature, and when the governor issued his veto letter, he said, now, you may not want to listen to a lecture from the executive branch, but you're probably passing too many bills. Can we try to dial it down? Well, that's how many he signed, but there were 591 that actually passed. So some of them are appropriations bills, all of those types of things. So yeah, it was a huge number, record setting. And he asked for them to try for 100 less next year.
Really?
Yeah.
So let's put that in context. Like, comparing the last couple of years, it's 559.
So the legislature's been passing more and more and more. So back in, I think probably like the 2000s, they were in the 300s. When I was in the legislature, which was 2011, we were just over 400. And then they just have been going up and up and up and up. And one of the things that happens, I think, is that you get less and less time to actually discuss each bill.
Yeah.
And a lot of them are not controversial. They pass unanimously, right? There's a lot that it just doesn't need to do a whole lot. But the ones he vetoed, he said, these could have been a phone call. You didn't have to write a bill and go through the whole process to address an issue that a simple phone call would have solved. So that's the encouragement, I think, from the governor, is to kind of dial it down, right? And legislators can, but they don't have to talk to each other. So you can have 5 legislators introduce 5 bills that are basically dealing with the same issue. And I think we see a lot of that. So there were over 100 bills this year dealing with education that touched on education, right? Some of them were good, some less good. Some of them were just kind of sideways, like landscaping at schools, right? But there were over 100. That's a lot.
Yeah. So that's interesting. I didn't realize that is... So if a constituent comes to me, I open up a bill. I don't have to see if anyone else is doing a bill similar.
Yeah, that's correct. And in fact, most legislators will keep them private until the language is drafted, they've approved it, they signed off on it. And so if they're not talking to their colleagues, there's no way for their colleagues to even see it. Yeah. So yeah, you could run a bill and your colleague down the road could run a bill and they could be very similar.
That seems a little bit of waste. I mean, I don't know. I haven't worked there, but it seems a little bit like it's a waste.
I don't know if there's a better system, a better way to do it where you have to make it public. And of course, there are some times where people say, hey, I'm working on this through the whole interim, and this is the bill, and this is, the language. But I mean, that's the system that we have right now. So anyway, his encouragement is do fewer bills.
Well, I guess we'll see next year. Next year how that happens.
Yeah.
So I'd love you to explain Utah policy.
Sure.
And what that is and how that kind of looked, what you're tracking during the session.
Yeah. So Utah policy is, I have a website, but it really is a daily newsletter. So it's every weekday. And I try to get it out by 7:30 in the morning. And what it does, it's a news curation newsletter that will really focus on Utah politics, especially during the session. In fact, I just talked to a lawmaker recently, and she told me, she said, you had things in Utah policy that I had no idea were going on the Hill, which actually didn't surprise me that much because she has her committees and the things that she's focused on, right? Yep. And I'm trying to give this big overview. Yep. Yeah. So that's the goal, right? So what I did was, even though there were over 900 bills introduced, not all of them got discussed in committee, but what I did was go through every single committee agenda, link to the agendas every day, so that if you had a particular interest, you could say, okay, business and labor, I'm going to click on that link, and then you could see the agenda every day. And then I would pull out 3 bills a day and say, these 3 are coming up today for discussion, just so you know. And so now that the session's over, I still do it every day. It's a year round. And it's looking at Utah politics, but also Utah news that's important, national news, and sometimes international news. So I do include things on Ukraine and Israel, Russia, those types of things. Yep.
Yeah, I love it's on Instagram.
I have a presence on Instagram as well. So I try to do a number of the day, a quote of the day. And then I do have a colleague who helps with video. So I do the recording and the script, and he puts the video together, and it's a short. So it's under 60 seconds.
I love that. In a minute.
You need to know, under 60 seconds every day. Yeah.
You do a really good job at making information both transparent and bite-sized.
Thanks.
Because I feel like that is part of the barrier for people getting involved.
It is. And that's one of the things I think that, because I've had so much experience in the political sphere, that I can take complex issues and really distill them down. Right. I mean, there were times where I looked at bills and there's like, you know what, I can't do this in 20 seconds. So I'll go on to another bill. But the policy issues should be digestible, right? We should be able to understand what people are talking about and what impacts the bills are going to have.
Yes. But we're 2 communications people, so of course we agree about that.
I want everybody to understand.
I want everybody to understand, because then you can participate. Yeah. Okay, so let's talk about a couple of bills that you were watching or that you thought were interesting this past session.
Well, I think the DEI bill at the beginning of the session, that bill was one that said we're going to get rid of all diversity, equity, and inclusion programs, statements, hiring, just really anything that looks at DEI from not only the university level, which is where we usually think DEI is happening, but also K through 12 and all government offices as well.
That's right.
So I think the impact is huge. I think that the legislature downplayed the impact. I think that we'll see it's far more than just a name change. So we've seen universities already changing names. The university, Utah Valley University was the first one to change their Office of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion to something else.
Institutional knowledge or something like that.
Support or something. I can't remember, but it was a change in name. But and the University of Utah also, the president of the university has assured people who have been working in the DEI space that they're not going to lose their jobs, but they're shifting. But I think what we're going to see is a trickle down, and in probably unfortunate ways. So this, I'll just tell you, just this week, there have been incidents in Park City of extreme racism and sexism and bullying, so much so that the Department of Justice got involved. They found 180 different instances in Park City school districts.
In a school district, okay.
In the school district, right? And they said, you have to solve these problems. Well, now that you can't have DEI, you can't talk about unconscious bias, you can't talk about explicit bias. How are they going to solve those problems, right? And then we're in the NCAA tournament, March Madness stuff, and we had the University of Utah women's basketball team say that they experienced racial slurs and what they considered racial hate crimes while they were at their tournament. And it's disconcerting, right? And it's sad. So we'll see. The proponents of the bill say they feel like it equalizes the playing field and they don't think it's going to cause damage. I am a little bit skeptical, but hopeful that they're correct, right? I don't want to see increased damage.
Yeah, because of course we want everyone to have an equal playing field. I think that's the point.
My kids, we have part of our large and unique family. We have 6 children who are Black, and they have gone to school in Utah County schools. And I will tell you that they've told me that every single day they had racial slurs thrown at them. Every single day, right? And for people to dismiss that and say, well, that's not really a thing, it is a thing.
It is a very real thing. Yes. Yeah. I'm so sorry that happened.
I'm sorry too, right? And I'm sorry for my kids to have to go through that. In fact, my youngest, she's almost 20 now, but she did not tell me how bad it was until after she graduated, because she knew I'd march myself down there and have a talk with that principal.
Do something good for you.
So I still have marched myself down there, but she was no longer a student. So
yeah, it's personal, right?
For sure. Yeah.
I think it is interesting that many of the people that I have talked to are like, these are our values.
Yeah.
And we'll still do this work.
Yeah.
No matter what you call it.
Right.
Because it's human work.
Right. So we want people to belong. We want people to feel like there's a place for them. We want them to feel welcome. I mean, I'm saying we in a broad we. I mean, I think that type of work is really important. I think the work that you're doing at WLI is it's exactly that, right? It's saying, look, we need to make sure that we're doing the best that we can to make sure that there's equal opportunity for everyone, even if we call it something different.
Yeah. Well, and the thing that we push up against with sometimes is if we give women more opportunities, then there won't be opportunities for men.
Yeah.
But that's never our intent. The intent is just to give the opportunities.
I think I've heard conversations multiple times about this, and that's a limited mindset, not the abundance mindset.
Yeah.
You can always grow the pie, right? So just because a woman becomes successful doesn't mean that a man gets stepped on.
It's taking something away.
Doesn't mean that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's very real for some people.
I know.
That's why it's tricky. That's why politics can be tricky.
It's so tricky.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I also want to point out, this is not just a Utah thing.
Nope.
The DEI bills like this are across the nation.
They're spreading across the nation for sure, and they're in red states, right? They're not spreading in the blue states, but it's a nationwide movement to get rid of programs that make some people feel uncomfortable. And what's super interesting to me is the governor of Alabama last week signed a bill getting rid of DEI programs the day before the 59th anniversary of Martin Luther King Jr.'s walk from Selma to Montgomery, Alabama. I mean, is that some irony or not, right? I mean, holy cow. Right?
His PR person should have said, maybe that's not the right time.
I know,
or maybe it was the right time.
And it's a she, actually. The governor is a she. So maybe they were not even aware. I don't even know, but it seems just so ironic that you would take away this ability to talk about why we're different and why the playing field isn't level. And when we pretend that it is, I think it's more damaging than when we say, look, there's some different things that we need to do, right? Yeah. Not everybody's starting at the same place on the starting line. Some are way, way back there. Some aren't even on the field.
Yeah. The difference between equality and equity.
Yeah, that's exactly right.
Yeah. And I think my perspective on it is like we need multiple tools in our toolbox to deal with this.
Yeah.
So if there's one tool you don't like let's retool things, but don't take away the whole toolbox.
Right. Exactly. Yeah. And, politics is meant to be slow and thoughtful, and we're having some really rapid swings, I think, in the United States lately. Mm-hmm. And so, I mean, I think over time there'll be some course correction. In Utah, I know the governor, when he signed the bill, said, this is a start. We expect that we'll come back and work on this because we know that we don't know for sure how it's going to play out.
Sure. Yeah.
Right. But I think one of the things that we're going to see is, I suspect, and I hope I'm wrong, more open racism, because now it feels like it's acceptable.
It was interesting, too, in the article I read about the president of the University of Utah, when people were like, why didn't you say something? Mm-hmm. Why didn't you go up and say this is not okay?
Yeah.
And they're like, because they just passed a law that we can't do that.
The year before. That's right.
Yeah.
Yep.
So it's also
The
intertwined.
legislature silenced them.
Yeah.
Yep.
It's tricky.
Tricky. Yep. Love them. Bless them.
Oh, absolutely. Like anyone who wants to run for office, like, thank you for doing that.
Yeah, look, it's hard. And I've been on the other side, and you've kind of become friends in the foxhole because you're just under fire all the time, it feels like. So I understand that the pressures are really intense, but not every bill that they pass is a good one.
So let's talk about that for just a minute. So you served in the House of Representatives. Were there bills that you either passed or didn't pass that you look back and say, probably should have done something else with that?
Yeah, actually, it happened while I was there. So it was that year, it was HB 477. It was a GRAMA bill, which is Transparency, Openness in Government.
Wait, I don't know what a GRAMA bill is.
So GRAMA is Government Records Access and Management Act.
Okay.
So it has to do with transparency and public records. And the Utah legislature passed a bill. We were, told we have to pass this bill. It's going to be okay. But what we're doing is trying to protect personal texts, like from me to my spouse. So that doesn't need to be part of the public record. Anyway, we passed the bill. There was a huge outcry. And immediately, like the next day, I was a freshman. There were several other freshmen who were like, this just doesn't pass the smell test. We ended up rescinding that bill, pulling it back, right? But the Utah legislature got the Black Hole Award from the Society for Professional Journalists that year, right? But
that doesn't sound good.
No, but so we didn't get that one right. But what's interesting is this year, the legislature passed more bills impacting transparency in a negative way or in a less transparent way than ever before. And there's very little outcry. And I will tell you what I think it is.
Yeah.
I think it started actually with Nixon, because Nixon started calling the press the enemy of the people. But that has trickled down. And as it continues to build really since like 2016, where you start to have this distrust in media, people don't care anymore. Right. And so,
well, how do you get the information, like, to even care?
Well, and so there's some of that, right? But when you call major news outlets fake news, right, there's so little trust. So when the media is saying this is a real issue, you, the public, aren't going to be able to have input on this. You're not going to be able to see, right, what's going on. They're trying to hide this work behind this, basically veil of government secrecy. Nobody cared.
Oh, that's so... I was going to say hopeless, but it's not. It's just tricky. It gets super tricky.
And politics is a pendulum, right? So things will swing back, but it's just interesting, right? So when I was in, that was 13 years ago, just huge outcry for one bill. This year, there was a half a dozen or more bills that have impacted the same law. So
yeah. Well, and of the 555 or 559,
591.
Thank you. There's probably only a handful that I tracked.
I tracked a lot. So there were a lot of really good bills that died this year, I think. But, pick a topic. I've written on domestic violence bills. There are some really good ones there. Yeah. There's Tyler Clancy, who's a new representative from Provo. He's the youngest in the legislature. He's 25 or 26. I can't remember when his birthday is. But he did some heavy lifting on victims' rights and it's one of the areas of legislative code where you kind of had pieces in lots of different places. And so he kind of pulled it all together and said, we're all going to talk to each other and we're going to make it easier for victims and their families to know how they can access compensation, how they can access therapy, how they can, where they can go and what they can do. So there's been some really good bills passed this legislative session too.
I love that. There was a bill about teachers getting maternal health, right?
Yep, that's a really good one.
I really appreciated that one. And also paying substitute teachers or paying teachers.
Student teachers.
Teachers,
yep. So that one is run by my friend, Representative Karen Peterson. And in fact, this was a surprise to many of the legislators. Student teachers pay for the privilege, right? They're paying tuition to finish up their education. They're not getting paid as a student teacher, and the workload is more than full time while you're trying to do lesson plans, et cetera, for that semester. So what they were seeing is they were trying to work on weekends, or, they were dropping out of college to go work for a year so that they could work really hard as a student teacher without getting paid. So what her bill does is offer $6,000 in a stipend to student teachers to finish their education and enter the workforce. And I think it's fantastic, and it passed.
I do
too.
Great. Yeah. That first year I did some student teaching. It is a heavy lift to try and orient and get all your stuff together. So I appreciated those. A couple of really good bills. Speaking of transparency and barriers and it being tricky, like, let's talk about women and entering politics.
Yeah, they should totally do it. It's lots of fun. It is fun.
It is fun. It can be fun.
It can be fun. Policy discussions can be really interesting, right? It's especially interesting if you can keep an open mind and find out other people's perspectives, right? So if you're speaking into the echo chamber and everybody agrees with you, you're probably missing some voices at the table,
for sure.
Right?
Yeah.
And I think the policy discussions where you've got people coming in and saying, well, did you think about how this impacts this and how these people would be impacted? And it's like, oh, no, I didn't. That's so interesting.
Or I don't care. They shouldn't be impacted. Or, people have all kinds of responses to politics. So we just went through caucus.
Yep.
Right?
Yep.
How would you suggest people get out of their echo chambers, particularly women, to get those other voices, to have those conversations?
Well, read Utah policy.
Absolutely. She does an amazing job.
Well, one of the things that's so interesting is I also do some speaking on media literacy. And what that really means is saying you've got to be careful in your media diet. You have to be selective, right? You can't just eat a diet of junk food all the time. So I'm sure you know this, and your listeners probably know this. Where do the 20-somethings get their news? TikTok, right? So I asked my daughter, how do you know if it's actually true? And she goes, well, because this guy said it.
I'm terrified by this whole thing. Yes, but that's very true.
But it's true, right?
Yes.
And that's where they are. So there are actually several good media bias charts that will show you kind of the bell curve, right? And you want to stick in the middle. And so if you're reading somebody consistently on the right, center right, even further right, also temper that with people on the left, right? Even it kind of makes you mad, right? But it gives you an idea about how people are covering the same kind of event, what types of things they're talking about. And they're good, solid media outlets kind of in the middle of that bell curve, right? And that's where I draw my content from. I don't go to the extremes on either side. I want to stick in the middle where I feel like it's more reliable.
Well, and you're a master at headlines, as I've read through your
headlines. I don't write the headlines, actually.
Well, okay, well, whoever's writing them is doing a really good job. The thing about getting news sources, we talk often about credible sources.
Yeah.
What is a credible source?
That's
and
right.
when you're talking to your legislator, what do they think is credible, right? Because you want to be talking to them in the words that they use.
Right.
So I love this idea of kind of curating and cultivating different sources.
Yeah.
And also, I like to say, figuring out when you're triggered by something that makes you really, really sad or something that makes you really, really angry.
Yeah.
Talk with that to a friend and talk through it.
That's right.
And then talk to your legislator about it.
Take a beat, right? And figure out, right? Look, so I spoke recently and said, I have never met a single legislator who has identified themselves as someone who is extreme. Never. They might exist,
interesting.
But no one defines themselves as extreme. Even people that are considerably further right than I am believe that they're center right, which pushes me over on the liberal spectrum, which is fine, whatever, right? But nobody defines themselves as an extremist. And they honestly, I haven't met anybody who is cruel, even though sometimes the legislation feels that way.
Yeah.
If you talk to them, they really, truly believe that they feel like they're doing a good job of solving a problem of some sort, right? So if we can remember that everybody, whether we agree with them or not, is a human being, that they have dignity, that they have a family, that they have people who love them, how do we interact with them? I think staying curious is one.
Absolutely.
Help me understand, right? Help me understand why.
Pat says that all the time. Like, tell me more about that. Tell me why you feel that way. What in your experiences has led you to believe this?
Yeah. And I've had experience with advocating for midwives. That's how I got involved in politics. And it was a controversial issue. It still is, but it's less so now than it was 20 years ago. And staying open and not burning bridges allowed us to get people to change their votes from a no to a yes. And part of it was just trying to meet them where they were and understand what were their fears, what were their understandings of the whole situation, right? And being able to...
A lot of education.
Yeah, a lot of education, right? Yep. And, and sometimes it feels like the process doesn't work well. Sometimes it's frustrating when you have all these people lined up to testify in a bill and it goes the other direction, even though their testimony was compelling.
Right.
But that doesn't mean you give up, right? I mean, politics
Mm.
is a long game.
It is a long game. I think people are surprised by that
They
when they
are.
get into it.
You don't just do a one and done, right? I
Yep.
mean, usually it's a multi-year process. I know that it took a really long time for Utah's first hate crime to pass. That was at least a decade-long process.
Wow.
It took multiple years for medicinal CBD to pass,
Yep.
but it passed, right? I mean, so these things do happen. It's just that it's a process and an iteration of over and over and over. And, you know, they work on that during the interim between legislative sessions. The
Which is
sessions
the
are only
best time
45
to
days long.
contact,
Yeah,
right,
for
your
sure, right?
legislator.
Otherwise they're way too swamped.
Yeah.
But yeah.
I think that does surprise people that I've talked to, both in my work before teaching people on the Hill what the process is, so where to put your voice, and also in our political development series, is usually people come up because they have like something they really care about it,
Right.
and they want it changed now.
Right now. Yeah.
And the fact that it might take 10 years for that is a
No.
little overwhelming.
It is.
Right?
It is.
Yeah.
Right. And then you go back to it's one step at a time and one win at a time. And
One conversation at a time.
it is, right? And
Mhm.
it's, winning hearts and minds, influencing friends and family, right? One person, one vote at a time. And
Mm.
look, politics is about relationships.
Yeah.
It's not only is it a long game, but it's about relationships. And so it's also finding your allies in that space. So if you're advocating for a specific issue and it's
Yeah.
only you're not going to have nearly as much success as
You need some friends.
right?
Yeah,
Right. As
yeah.
people who are in a specific legislator's district or groups who are already working on similar legislation
Yeah.
or similar issues, right? Where you can partner together.
Yeah.
That again, that builds broader coalitions, and then legislators are more apt to listen when you've got, 50 phone calls coming in versus one saying, please listen to me.
Right. Well,
it makes a difference.
and from a business perspective, we often tell women, know what you want,
Mhm.
but then know who to talk to,
Yeah.
who can open those doors or make decisions to help you get what you want.
Yeah.
Which I feel like is what you're saying
Yeah.
about politics
Yeah.
too.
Yep. Same.
I think, so you wrote an article at the end of last year in the Desert News about 13 years since so now we have Celeste Malloy.
That's right. 13 years since we had two
Yep,
people.
Celeste Malloy and Lieutenant Governor Henderson.
That's right. Yep.
13 years.
Yeah. Yeah.
And it's
been
only
a while.
two.
I know.
I want to rejoice that it's
We've
two.
never had more than two. So yeah. Yep. Jan Graham and I think Olene Walker.
Yeah.
And then we also had a year where we had Jan Graham and we had Enid Green, who's now Enid Mickelson, in Congress. But yeah, we don't have a lot of women at the high levels of elected office in the state of Utah. We've never had a female senator from the state of Utah. Martha Hughes Cannon was maybe going to be there, but she got pregnant, so then she couldn't run. So
We started out so promising.
state senator, she did great. We love Martha. So yeah, I mean those types of things, right? But you can't generally say, "Hey, I'm going to go for U.S. senator as my first run for political office," right?
I mean, you can.
You can,
But
but
you're
I
probably
say
not gonna
generally
be-
not,
Yeah,
right?
very successful.
It's usually a long process of learning the political sphere. I'm not
Yep.
saying that there's a pecking order. That's not what I mean. What I mean is there's ways for you to gain experience. So I never served on the city level. I wasn't on city council. I didn't do anything like that. I went from working in advocacy on the Hill
Okay.
to being very involved in Republican Party politics to the level of not only was I precinct chair, but I became the legislative
Yeah.
district chair, stayed very involved. And then when there was a midterm vacancy, I was ready to step up and
Right.
run. Right.
Because
But-
they knew you. There was some visibility there.
Right. And I had been communicating with them. Right. So some people will do it like that.
Yeah.
Some people will say, I'm going to do city council first and then I'll run for the legislature. Some people have a professional career that touches on politics. And then
Right.
they say, okay, now I'm ready to run. Right. There's a variety of ways to enter,
Yeah.
but there's almost always some kind of experience in the background before you get there.
Yep. Like you said before, it's a long game.
It is.
Yeah.
And, one of the things that women do, though, that male candidates don't do is women often think they have to know 100% of everything before they can run. It's
Yes.
just simply not true. And it's not possible. You can't know everything about
Right.
everything. And you don't have to know everything. And I promise the male candidates just don't do that. I mean,
but I think we feel like we have to be credible.
We do, right? So we have to feel like, oh, well, I can talk on any topic at any time to, any TV reporter anywhere. And it's like, yeah, but,
So how do you show that you're credible without knowing all the things?
Well, that's the women's double bind.
Yeah.
So you have to be nice and you have to be competent and you can't be too much of either one, right? It's totally true.
Can't be too nice, can't be too competent.
That is exactly right.
That is true. Okay.
And you can see it in the way female candidates are treated from the local level to the, the ultimate run for president level. But I think one of the things that female candidates can do, right, is they figure out, well, why are they running? You have to know the answer to that.
Right.
If your answer is, well, I just thought it would be good for my resume. Don't do that, right? Know what your answer is. Know what your passion is. Know why you're running, what you want to do, right? And you can always talk about those types of things. One of the things that I think is so super interesting from the outside, I see a lot more female candidates do this than male, and that is talk about the we, the collective.
Yes.
We in our community.
Yeah.
This is what we are seeing with our kids, right? And you see male candidates do that too. They talk about their kids and their grandkids and wanting them to grow up here in a good environment.
Yeah.
But women are a lot of times, I know this goes to Pat's research and her talk on
absolutely.
the neurological differences between men and women, the neuroscience, I guess, the neuroscientific differences. Women are very collaborative in general, right? Everything is general. But women are very collaborative, and they're that way in their campaigns too, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's not just, I am the most conservative person on the block and vote for me because I'm conservative. It is, this is what we can do together as our community to make our community better. And I think that resonates a lot of times, right? It really does.
So harnessing that power of the collective, and the credibility comes in knowing and understanding your why and bringing other people along with you.
Yeah, for sure, right? And again, you can't run by yourself. Right. You have to have volunteers. You have to have people who help. You have to get the message out. You have to get your voters to the polls. They have to vote.
Yeah,
right?
It was
all of those
so
things.
Low. They just said like 2.9 or something. That's
actually the overall total for the caucuses. If you're thinking about that, the caucuses had 9.5% turnout of all registered Republicans in the state. Just not good.
That just
very low.
Yeah, about not representative.
Yeah, it was almost 50% when we had mail-in ballots for the primary in 2020. And it was maybe 35 to 40%. I can't remember exactly when we did the presidential preference poll in 2016. Yeah. But this year,
not as much.
Nope, less than 10%.
Oh my goodness. Okay, so I have a quote that I loved that you put up. I'm a quote lover, so let's talk about this. This is from Madeleine Albright. I made women's issues central to American foreign policy, not because I was a feminist, but because we know that societies are more stable if women are politically and economically empowered.
Yeah.
Like it's a researched fact.
Oh, yeah. So this is part of my international relations work. So one of the contributors to the Deseret News on a regular basis is Dr. Valerie Hudson. She was at BYU. She's now down at Texas A&M. But her whole professional career is on international relations, looking at women's influence, especially in like the peace building area. Yeah. And so what we know from research is if women are involved in peace building, the peace agreements last longer, they're more stable, and they're more accepted by the general population. What we know with economic empowerment for women is that not only are the women healthier, but their children are healthier. Their children go to school more. Yeah. The child death rate decreases as women are more economically empowered and as they get more educated. And unfortunately, the same is not true of empowering men economically. So when you see a lot of nonprofit work in the international space, a lot of them really focus on women. And that's why, because it trickles down to the family. The money gets to the family where it really needs to go to really strengthen that fundamental unit.
Because if you raise up a woman, you can raise up a whole community. Yeah. And not always, but
and what Valerie said is if you look at the countries, the way they treat their women is the way they act on the international stage. So there are countries where sexual assault is considered a property crime. It's not a crime against a person. It's a property crime for the man, right? And you see countries where women are so devalued that on the international stage, they don't value women, and on any stage, right? Whether that's somebody coming to talk to them from the UN or the United States or whatever, right? So if they're violent against their women in the home, that violence often translates to violence on the international stage.
It's so interconnected.
Yeah,
very. And sometimes we pretend like it's not. But it
right.
Really
we
is.
Pretend it doesn't really matter, right? Well, men, women, it doesn't really matter. It does matter. It makes a really big difference, actually. Yeah.
So this is a great pivot into your Ph.D. and your dissertation and that grassroots work, right? Yeah. Tell us a little bit about that.
Okay. So first I have to tell you that I did not go back to school until I was 49. So
Which I adored. I love that.
And so if for anybody who thinks it's too late, it's not too late. So I had an associate degree in nursing and I stayed home and raised my family. I also was involved in politics and did some other things, but mostly I was a stay-at-home mom. And at 49, I actually lost an election and decided, fine, I'm going to go to school. So that's when I got my bachelor's degree in communication, focused on public relations. And then when I graduated, I had run again, lost another election, and I'm like, okay, fine, I'm going to go get my master's degree. So I did that. And when I finished that, I was partway through my master's degree, and my husband started saying, you should probably just get a PhD. And I'm like, no.
You're like, that's a commitment.
I am not smart enough to get a PhD.
You did not say that,
Holly.
I did. You did.
Oh, yeah.
Even after all of this.
Oh, yeah. I said, I am not smart enough to get a PhD. I might get a second master's. And he said, I really think you should just go get a PhD. And I'm like, fine, I'll apply.
Shout out to your husband for that.
Yeah, really. Because I did not decide until like almost the deadline to apply. I decided like 2 days before I had to take the GRE, whatever, to get in. And I'm like, okay, this is wild. So I just showed up, took it, didn't do that great, but But I submitted applications to 2 programs. One sent me a nice rejection letter, and the other one said, yeah, sure, come on in. And so I started the program when I was 53. 53.
Were people like, why are you doing this now? Like, what's the point?
No, mostly they weren't. And I was surprised at that, even though I was older than a lot of my professors. They were encouraging and they were supportive, right? And but I will tell you, it was hard. It was really hard. It was a lot harder than I thought it was going to be. I thought it might be a continuation of the master's degree that I had done, and it was very, very different.
Because they were pretty back to back, right?
They were all back to back. So so I didn't lose an election before I started my PhD program. So I learned I can be taught. But I graduated at 51 with my bachelor's, and I was 53 with my master's, and 57 when I got my PhD, which was just 2 years ago. So now I'm 59, almost 60, which is crazy to me. So anyway, one of the things that I was super interested in was international humanitarian work. And I had been involved in that for, I think my first international humanitarian trip was 2006. So it's been a while. And I was super interested in that. And the University of Utah has, under the political science program, they also have nonprofit management, public administration. So that's the track that I took with international relations as a minor. And my dissertation looked at grassroots nonprofit organizations doing international humanitarian work. And what I mean by grassroots are these really small ones. So you have something like Save the Children.
So this is not like Red Cross.
It's not Red Cross. So Save the Children is like a multi-billion-dollar organization. They're all over the world. They're highly structured, lots of employees.
Right.
What I'm talking about, what I'm talking about are these small ones, which there's a lot of commonalities between them. So you've got somebody who goes on a trip, they see something and they're like, oh my gosh, I got to make a difference. I'm going to go home. I'm going to start a nonprofit and we're going to build a school. Right. There's lots of those.
Because that's what we do.
That's right.
Yeah. Yep.
So one of the things that another researcher found is that 75% of those have an annual income of $25,000 or less in the first 5 years. And many of them after that 5-year mark end up kind of dying off and disappearing, right? It's because they have to transition to a more professionalized. Sure. So what they do is they really depend on volunteer labor. Right. So what I was looking at is those people who are leading teams of volunteers to these places where maybe no one has ever seen that level of extreme poverty before. They don't know how to handle necessarily the extreme poverty. I was really looking at the emotional impact on the volunteer leaders and the emotional labor that they have to engage in to say, I have to deal with my own emotions. I have to deal with my volunteers' emotions. I have to deal with the local community, right? And all of that. And the reality is they burn out and then they leave, right? And they don't work in the nonprofit space anymore. I can
totally see this.
Yeah.
Yes.
So yeah, it ended up being 267 pages long.
You're a prolific
the
writer.
Most I've ever. Oh, I write short though because I'm a columnist. I write 600 to 800 words. This thing was 67,000 words, and I'm like, oh my gosh!
Congratulations! Let's just take a moment to like be excited and congratulate you on this.
Thank you so much.
Huge accomplishment. One reason why I found that so fascinating is there's two things that I want to go to here. Is I often feel like women's work is never done.
Well, that is true.
It's never done. And because we are like, I see this need and I want to help and I jump in. Like many nonprofits are like, I'm going to jump in. I'm going to gather my friends. We're going to use our money. We're going to make a difference. And then 5-10 years later, like.
That's the definition of a grassroots organization. Yep.
Yeah. So it's like, but if you can get it right, the beauty of it is that a woman's work is never done. Like if you can actually support and understand those transitions, then your legacy and the legacy that you leave for others can have a huge impact.
Yeah, for sure. And one of the things I think that we don't talk enough about yet is the impact of Western culture saying we're going to go save people in the developing world, right? So we call it white savior complex sometimes, right? But really what it is we think we know. And I found myself that way in my first trips, right? And I tried to become more and more sensitive, the more and more aware that I became, right? I went to Africa. I've been to Africa multiple times, and I've seen clothes donated from the United States end up on kids in Africa. And we're talking like camisoles from a woman's underwear drawer on a little girl as a dress. I'm like, that's not that useful, right? Or high heel shoes sent to a place where they don't have paved roads, right? So sometimes you see stuff like that and you say, well, is that actually the best use of our time, our resources, right? It makes us feel good to say, I've donated to Africa. I sent them my t-shirt or whatever.
Right.
But sometimes that's not the best use of our resources.
No. We checked a box, but did we really go in and help support them?
I don't want to discourage anybody from being involved in nonprofit work and helping and service, right?
No,
I think those are super important.
Yeah.
But it's also okay to ask questions and say, okay, how is this benefiting? If I go over and I build a school, did I just put all of the carpenters and electricians out of business for 2 weeks? Right? We have to ask those kinds of questions, I think, to have a healthier relationship between what we call the first world countries and the developing world. So
that's so fascinating. I have a friend who does humanitarian service, and she was talking about this village she was in, and there were lots of donations and gifts.
Yeah.
But what the kids really wanted was connection.
Yeah.
Right?
Right.
Not all the gifts.
Right.
So I really appreciate that thoughtful and deliberate approach, because we can do a lot.
Yeah.
But it needs to be thoughtful, to be sustained, and also have an impact.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yep.
So I also want to touch on this idea of visibility, because often in these conversations, two things come up with leadership, women's leadership in particular. Leadership is visibility. Like you talked a little bit about, like being involved in your party, your name was there. So when there's a place.
Yep.
And then also the ability to practice leadership. So one thing that I am struggling with is in our legislature, which is 74% male.
Yep.
Oftentimes women who are doing the work don't get their name on the bill, which is okay because we don't always have to be recognized. But if their names aren't there and visible, that's also a problem too. So work through that with me.
So not just legislatively, but one of the things that we know with women in leadership circles, even in those spaces, right? They may have a seat at the table, but they may not have a voice. And that is some great research out of BYU about how men and women, groups of men and women together, how
it's like 30% is the tipping point.
You've got to have at least that many, right?
Yeah.
So one of the things that's interesting, and it's a tactic that other women can do, is amplification. So that is, if somebody is talking over the woman, if somebody is talking over, like interrupting, if they're taking credit for her idea, it's okay for another woman, or it can be a man, right?
Yeah,
As long as they're aware, who can say, wait, Patty wasn't done telling me her idea, or that was a really great idea Patty had. I'm so glad you think so now, right? Those types of things. But really, it's that way of saying, it's the amplifying. And sometimes it's a matter of people aren't aware. They don't realize that they're doing it always. And it's fine, I think, for people to say, look, it's okay for us to say, hey, that was my idea.
It's that thing you started with, like between being kind and what were those two?
Competent.
Yes, kind and competent.
Yep, likable and competent. Yep. It's the double bind, because really it's impossible to be both. But at the legislature, there's so much at play, right, with leadership and who's in leadership and who gets to run what bills. And
yes.
So there's more jockeying that way than you might think. But anytime that any woman in any space can say, look, this bill on childcare passed. I really like that. For example, Senator Luz Escamilla started the bill. It ended up being run by Representative Ray Ward. I'm making stuff up, right?
Sure. Yeah.
But that's okay, right? Because it's like they worked together, and I'm really glad to see this kind of synergy, right? Anytime you can start to bring those names in, I think
that way, and throw
you
that
amplify
thread throughout it.
Yeah,
I love that idea. Yeah. Because there is some jockeying there to who gets the bill, who can pass it, all those kind of things.
And most freshmen don't get heavy lifts, right? You have to learn the process. Even if you've been an ardent observer, learning the process is
sure it's
a little more.
Yeah.
It's a little more than it looks like. So a lot of times you don't see freshmen doing heavy lifts. Again, Tyler Clancy is an exception there, but there's a new representative, Ariel DeFay. She was midterm vacancy replacement right before the session started, and she had several really great bills, right? And so anytime you have an opportunity to talk about that, that's great. I also think it's great if members of the public, and if you're not in the legislature, but you're a woman in business, or, even if you're feel like you're not super active in politics, you can always reach out to legislators and say, thank you. They get a lot of hate mail. So
love the thank you.
Getting thank yous and saying, hey, look, I watched you testify in this bill. I'm so appreciative of what you did, whether the bill passed or not, right?
Yeah.
And if you've got an idea for a bill, you can always reach out to somebody and say, hey, I know that you're super interested in this particular issue. So am I. Have you ever thought about running a bill? Or can I help you? Because I know you ran a bill. It didn't get all the way through last year. What can I do?
Yeah. I especially love that idea with people who might not always politically align with you.
Yeah.
But noticing when they do something and just saying thank you for it.
Yeah.
I've seen that go a long way.
Yeah. And again, that goes back to, let's see everybody as humans, right? And we're all trying to do our best. How do we get there? I will tell you, if you want to know how to work well with others, look at the minority party, right?
Because they have to.
They have to if they're going to be effective, right? And there have been some minority lawmakers in Utah that are so strident. They're like, a lot of times they only last one term. Even their own colleagues sometimes don't get along very well with them. But if you have somebody who can figure out how to get their important bills passed, and they're in the minority party, they know relationships, they know how to do politics.
That's a great tip. Yeah, because they can be principled, but also people-oriented.
Absolutely, right? And being willing to say, look, I'll take an inch. If I can't go, the length of the football field, but I can get a first down, I'm going to do it, right?
Or some people would think that's a cop-out.
Right.
But really, that's just how it works.
But that is how it works, right?
Yeah.
And I think sometimes we do have this idea that it's an all or nothing mentality.
Yep.
Politics really isn't like that. And to count your wins where you can get them, if you can narrow your focus and really narrow and really narrow and really narrow, then you probably can get your bill through, right?
Yeah. Well, Holly, this has been delightful. I mean, we could talk about so many things.
We could.
As we leave this, what are your hopes for what is Utah doing really, really well? And what are your hopes for maybe in the next 5 years, things that we see that could change?
I think Utah overall is doing really well at recognizing that we have room to improve as it comes to the status of women in our state. I think it makes people uncomfortable. I don't think that's a bad thing. Sometimes I think that's a good thing.
Yeah.
But we live in a state that values, at least we say we value family and And yet we have a really high rate of domestic violence. Okay, well, we've been shining some light on that, and we've been seeing some changes made, and those are important and those are good, right? So I think being willing to have the conversation, I think those are good things. I think overall, we're going to continue to see people move in to the state, depending on the politics, I guess, how it goes. But and we need to remember that unless we were Native Americans living here before 1847, we're immigrants to this area, right?
Yeah.
And that we can put out the welcome mat and we can say, look, you can come from California and you can live here.
And we can still be friends.
And we can still be friends.
Yep.
Or you can come from Wyoming, or you can come from a different country, right? And I have such a big family. We've got kids that are that we adopted internationally, but I also have kids that are marrying into families with international backgrounds, right? And I think it's great. So Utah has been a welcoming community, and I hope it continues to stay that way.
I love that. I love being able to end on that. A welcoming community, belonging for more and more.
Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Holly.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.